Content warning. This episode describes violent crime, including the murder of a child and sexual assault in restrained, factual terms. Viewer discretion is advised. They called themselves a couple, but together they became a machine for murder. What began as a series of petty crimes and manipulations escalated into a cross-country spree that left families shattered and law enforcement scrambling. The shocking truth behind America's most disturbing serial killer couple is not only about individual brutality, it is about how charm, coercion, and a patchwork of institutional failures combined to let two people terrorize large parts of the Midwest in the summer of 1984. I've reviewed court records, contemporary reporting, police testimony, and interviews with survivors and relatives. What emerges is a pattern, a primary perpetrator with a long history of criminality and escalation, a vulnerable woman drawn into a violent orbit, and a trail of victims whose names must not be reduced to headlines. This is their story and the lesson it forces us to confront. Alton Coleman grew up in the shadow of small-town anonymity north of Chicago. Childhood accounts described a young man who was isolated, frequently bullied, and increasingly drawn to risky behaviors. Neighbors later recalled a loner who had intermittent run-ins with the law, arrests for vandalism, petty theft, and other low-level offenses that in isolation might have sounded like a troubled youth. But those brushes with authority revealed a harsher pattern. Coleman had a capacity for intimidation and manipulation that surfaced long before the murders. As an adult, his offenses escalated in both scope and cruelty. Reports from acquaintances and victims describe someone who could be affable when it served his purposes, quick to lie, and alarmingly adept at exploiting gaps in oversight. Substance abuse appeared repeatedly in interviews and in testimony, alcohol and drugs that contributed to volatility and impaired judgment. Simultaneously, witnesses reported a fascination with the macabre, morbid stories, crude boasts, and an attraction to control that shifted from minor thefts to more sinister acts over time. In many ways, the trajectory follows a darkly familiar script. Petty crime, unchecked aggression, and what experts often call behavioral escalation. But escalation alone does not explain what happened next. The critical, fatal variable was the relationship Coleman formed with Deborah Brown. Deborah Brown was not born into notoriety. Her history, as described in court records and family accounts, shows a woman marked by vulnerability. Family instability, episodes of abuse in her past, and a search for validation left her open to influence. Those who knew her before she met Coleman say she wanted to belong, to be loved, and that she was prone to making choices under pressure where the consequences were poorly understood. Their meeting catalyzed a destructive partnership. According to interviews and trial testimony, Coleman pursued Brown aggressively, offering attention, protection, and a warped sense of purpose. For Coleman, Brown was both partner and instrument, a person he could manipulate into assisting or witnessing his crimes. For Brown, the relationship was complex, a mix of fear, dependency, and at moments fear-driven compliance. Courts later sifted evidence to assess culpability. The record shows instances of coercion and intimidation alongside episodes where Brown either participated in or failed to stop violent acts. The ethical and legal difference between coercion and complicity became one of the central questions in their prosecutions. By mid-1984, the couple's criminal behavior had moved into a new register. Over the course of just weeks, they began a violent interstate spree that traversed multiple Midwestern states. Their actions were not random wanderings, they followed a pattern.
They would arrive in a town with the pretense of ordinary travelers, then seek opportunity. A convenience store, a lonely house, a hand on a door. When challenged, they were willing to use force, threats with weapons, abduction at gunpoint, carjacking. Sometimes they fled quickly, sometimes they lingered, leaving one survivor with memory and terror while another life ended. One of the most wrenching cases from those weeks is the abduction and murder of 7-year-old Tamika Turk. The details of Tamika's killing are harrowing and deeply tragic, and they demand restraint in how they're recounted. Court records and witness statements show that Tamika was taken in the course of the couple's spree and was murdered. Her death became a focal point of outrage and grief. For her family, a child's life was senselessly ended, and whatever explanations the perpetrators might offer could never bridge that loss. Tamika's name must be spoken with the care and gravity it deserves. Other victims included adults who were robbed, assaulted, or murdered as the pair moved from city to city. Donna Williams, Marlene Waters, Eugene Scott. Each of these names marks a person with a life, a family, routines that were violently disrupted. Some victims were killed outright, others survived but bore psychological wounds that would last a lifetime. In several cases, survivors later provided key testimony. The memory of a face in the trunk, the sound of a car door, the smell of gasoline. Small details that helped investigators reconstruct the path of a couple who tried to dissolve themselves into the anonymity of the road. Tactically, Coleman and Brown used a mix of brute force and disturbing improvisation. They abandoned stolen cars to confuse pursuers. They posed as ordinary travelers to gain trust. At times, they appeared charming, friendly even, coaxing strangers into small acts of assistance before turning violent. Their mobility across state lines complicated police efforts. Multiple jurisdictions, scattered witness reports, and inconsistent record sharing slowed a coordinated response. In several localities, earlier accusations against Coleman had been dropped or minimized, allowing him to move with less suspicion. These gaps in communication and legal follow-through were not the cause of the murders, but they were enabling conditions that turned a dangerous man into a national threat. The arrest itself was oddly prosaic. After weeks of terror, the couple made a public appearance at a local athletic event where someone recognized them. Law enforcement, alerted by tipsters and the accumulation of small, verifiable links, license plate sightings, eyewitness descriptions, and finally physical evidence found in abandoned vehicles, moved in. It was a reminder that even the most calculated criminals can be undone by ordinary citizens who remember a face or the peculiar detail of a red jacket. Once in custody, Coleman initially maintained silence. Brown's story shifted over time. She ultimately cooperated with investigators to varying degrees, providing confessions and testimony that would be crucial at trial. For prosecutors, Brown's cooperation complicated the public narrative. Was she a victim of manipulation who broke free and sought to right wrongs by speaking, or was she a willing participant who later tried to reduce her liability? Courts took those questions seriously, and juries were tasked with sorting through coercion, opportunity, and individual responsibility. The trials that followed were high-profile and emotionally charged. Prosecutors in multiple states sought the harshest penalties, and juries wrestled with the evidence of direct action versus influence. Coleman was convicted of numerous counts of murder and other violent crimes. He received the death penalty in at least one jurisdiction. Ultimately, the justice system carried out that sentence. Brown also faced capital exposure, with convictions and death sentences recorded in some cases, though litigation and appeals would complicate her final disposition. The appellate process raised familiar issues, questions about due process, about whether jurors could fairly disentangle abuse from agency, and whether sentences met constitutional muster. These legal battles played out over years as the families of victims watched courts parse the difference between punishment and closure. Beyond convictions and executions, the aftermath for survivors and families is a long, uneven landscape. Mothers and fathers, grandparents and friends were left to handle practical matters, funerals, legal filings, and the sudden absence of those they loved, and emotional ones that resist tidy resolution. Survivors of attacks carried invisible scars, recurring nightmares, and a chronic distrust of strangers.
One family member told a reporter years later that they felt justice had been done in court, but nothing could replace evenings and milestones that would never occur. That sentiment appears again and again in contemporary interviews. Convictions bring accountability, but they do not restore what was taken. When we step back and ask the broader question, the shocking truth promised by the title, the answer is unsettling because it reveals several intersecting failures. First, there was the personal pathology, a man prone to violence who cultivated an identity as someone who could control and dominate. Experts who reviewed Coleman's life after the fact pointed to a constellation of factors: early abuse, increasing criminal sophistication, substance abuse, and possibly delusional beliefs that made him dangerous. He reportedly embraced notions of magical thinking and claimed beliefs that observers later described as voodoo or occult practices. It is crucial to treat those claims as what they were: reported beliefs, symptomatic perhaps of delusion or manipulative theatrics, not evidence of supernatural power. Second, there was the interpersonal dynamic between Coleman and Brown. Coercion, emotional dependence, and fear created a situation in which a vulnerable woman made choices under acute pressure. That dynamic challenges simple narratives of villain and victim. Brown's involvement cannot be reduced either to total agency or total victimhood. The truth lies in the messy, uncomfortable middle, where blame and empathy must be balanced carefully, where courts must assign responsibility with both rigor and caution. Third, institutional and systemic gaps amplified the danger. Fragmented law enforcement jurisdiction across state lines, a tendency in some locales to downplay early complaints, and procedural missteps all contributed to a window of opportunity that the couple exploited. In several communities, earlier allegations against Coleman were not pursued aggressively. If they had been, the later bloodshed might have been averted or limited. That is a bitter conclusion, one that forces law enforcement and policymakers to examine how agencies communicate across borders and how early warning signs are handled. Psychologically, the story illustrates how charisma can mask malice. Coleman could be personable, and that charisma enabled manipulation. Brown's vulnerability made her susceptible to becoming a partner in crime rather than an independent actor who resisted. When charisma, coercion, and volatility combine, ordinary social safeguards, community vigilance, social supports, and criminal justice interventions may be insufficient. It is equally important to resist simplifying motives into a single cause. Some accounts emphasize substances, others highlight alleged mystical beliefs, still others point to intrinsic cruelty. The most defensible conclusion is that multiple factors converged: a predisposition to violence, enabling social conditions, substance abuse, and a particular relational dynamic that allowed one person to steer another into complicity. There is also a moral dimension that goes beyond psychology and policy. The families of the victims, the survivors, and the communities left to process fear and grief deserve more than the public spectacle of a trial. They deserve remembrance and dignity. Naming the victims, Tamika Turk, Donna Williams, Marlene Waters, Eugene Scott, is a small corrective to a culture that can reduce real human lives to statistics. Each name represents a set of relationships, routines, and unrealized futures.
Any retelling that centers the killers must be careful not to swallow the story whole. In the years since, the legal aftermath continued to raise questions about the death penalty, appellate fairness, and the limits of punishment to heal trauma. Executions and long sentences closed legal chapters, but they did not repair the ongoing psychological and social consequences. Families testify to anniversaries that reopen wounds, to holidays spent without a beloved presence, and to a community memory that is now forever marked by terror. For law enforcement, the case became an object lesson in interagency coordination and in the need to take even low-level complaints seriously when they fit a pattern. What must we learn from this? First, that violence rarely appears instantaneously. It is often preceded by escalating misbehavior that, if noticed and taken seriously, can be interrupted. Second, that relationships can be vectors for harm when coercion meets vulnerability. Protecting those at risk requires social supports and interventions that do not simply criminalize every outcome, but that prevent escalation. Third, that cross-jurisdictional crime demands better communication, faster evidence sharing, and protocols that prevent dangerous individuals from exploiting gaps between police districts and courtrooms. Finally, the most shocking truth may be the banality of how it all unfolded. These were not cinematic monsters acting from some outside mythology. They were people living in ordinary towns, making decisions, traveling, adopting disguises of normalcy, until the moment they revealed their capacity for violence. That ordinariness is terrifying because it suggests that vigilance, compassion, and a robust justice system are our primary defenses. As we close this account, let us return to the victims and to the hard work of remembrance. Tamika Turk and the others who perished cannot be brought back. Their families continue, in private and public ways, to make sense of what happened and to demand changes that might spare others the same fate.
If there is any single imperative from this story, it is that society must learn to connect the dots earlier, to treat warnings as warnings, to support the vulnerable before they are manipulated, and to build systems that do not let dangerous people slip through jurisdictional cracks. If this episode spoke to you, consider subscribing for more investigative deep dives into cases that shape how we think about crime and community. The case of Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown remains a difficult, sobering chapter in American criminal history. It forces a question that we cannot answer with simple rhetoric. How do we balance accountability with an honest examination of the conditions that allow two people to become a pair of killers? The answer is not legislative alone, nor is it simply about punishment. It will require better systems of prevention, a willingness to confront uncomfortable social dynamics, and an enduring commitment to the memories of those who suffered. For those who lost loved ones, for the survivors who carry wounds, and for the communities that still replay the summer of 1984 in memory, the final word is this: names matter, facts matter, and vigilance matters. Remember the victims more than the headlines. Learn from the failures. Demand better coordination and care. That is the most actionable, least sensational way to honor what was lost. If you found this episode informative, subscribe and check the playlist for more deep dives.